Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and give a summary of our findings over the last 5 years. So just to start off with, I'll just give a bit of background on trunk disease so that we're all on the same page. So these diseases are caused by a number of different fungi that colonise the wood and cause wood discoloration, decay and necrosis, and also cause various foliar symptoms. There are two main diseases in mature vineyards in New Zealand, and these are caused by various fungi of the Botryosphaeriaceae family and Utipa. So these are, I'll just from now on refer to them as BD and ED. These diseases primarily are caused by infection by airborne spores through pruning wounds, and they move down the trunk. Also known as top-down trunk diseases. The disease progresses very slowly, and it can take many years before you see any signs of the disease. What is the cost to growers? These diseases over time cause significant yield and quality reductions and eventually kill the vines. Surveys conducted now more than 5 years ago have shown increasing numbers of incidents of trunk disease in our vineyards as they age, and as a result of no wound protection in the early years of these blocks. How is it managed? As I mentioned, protection of pruning wounds is the primary way of preventing trunk disease. There's no curative treatments for these diseases. One option in the absence of any curative treatments is using remedial surgery, and this is only effective on top-down trunk diseases. Remedial surgery, as shown in the photo, involves removing the diseased trunk and growing a new trunk to help improve productivity and extend the life of the vines. Because the established root system is retained, remedial surgery is often more cost-effective than replacement, but the efficacy of the treatment really is dependent on complete removal of the infected wood and the growth of new water shoots. So in 2019, a project was started as part of the Vineyard Ecosystems program to address key industry questions on trunk disease management using remedial surgery, and to help develop best practice recommendations for New Zealand growers. We are looking to address key industry questions on when to intervene, where to cut the vine, when to cut the vine, and what the impact is, begin to understand what the impact is of this management practice on vine health and longevity and vine productivity. So 3 trials were established in mature commercial vineyard blocks that required reworking. One in Marlborough in an organic cane-pruned Sauvignon Blanc block, and 2 trials in Hawke's Bay in conventionally managed spur-pruned blocks of Cabernet and Merlot. Remedial surgery was carried out each winter and or spring, just except for the last year, over a span of 5 years, with a portion of vines being left untreated for comparative analysis, and the treatments were done on a whole row basis randomly across the block. For the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the trial in Marlborough for this presentation today, but the results were pretty consistent across all the trials. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving it forward. Thank you. So extensive scientific data was gathered from each of the trials looking at the progression of trunk disease in mature vines, both in the canopy and the trunk, the occurrence of pathogens in advance of visible wood staining and at the basal end of new trunks, the recovery of water shoots following remedial surgery, and the impact of trunk disease and remedial surgery on vine productivity. So to be able to understand how the disease progresses over time, we developed a scheme for assessing the incidence and severity in the canopy. This involved looking at the gaps in the canopy and around shoots around the head, and this shows you a sort of summary of how we assess severities from a scale from 0 to 100%, with 100% having no growth around the head or on the canes. So as I mentioned before, timely intervention is really important for effective disease control and preventing vine death with remedial surgery. And often growers will delay remedial surgery until they see a decline in productivity. And as you can see on these graphs, which show the severity of dieback in the canopy and the yield on this side, when you wait till you see a decline in productivity, often the incidence of trunk diseases or dieback in the canopy, is very high already, and the severity of the disease is increasing. As I mentioned, we also tracked the progression of staining in the trunk and used a similar sort of procedure for assessing the severity based on the area of the cross-section that had staining. So in trunks you can see various types of staining. This is what we refer to as central staining, which eventually, as it expands, does reach the edge of the trunk. This type of staining is often associated with Botrytis dieback versus wedge staining, which is often associated but not always with Utica dieback. And you can have both. So using this system, we assessed the severity of staining both in the upper trunk and the lower trunk, as well as the incidence, and compared to yield. And again, what you see is that at the time when you start to see a decline in productivity, your staining is already very high in the upper trunk, but also down lower in your trunk, and the severity is increasing. So really, it's advisable to intervene before you start seeing a decline in productivity to give remedial surgery its best chance of being effective. We found that very often the severity of staining in your trunk doesn't correlate strongly with the severity of dieback in the canopy. And as you know, the disease can infect over multiple years, and it's slow to develop. So often what you end up having is trunks where infections, even though dieback in the canopy is all the same, infections can have travelled various distances down the trunk. As well as trying to effectively remove the disease trunks, you also need to have new water shoots grow for remedial surgery to be effective. And we found that there was a correlation in water shoot presence following remedial surgery and the severity of disease in the canopy and in the trunk. And here on this graph demonstrates how, as the severity of dieback in the canopy increases, the proportion of vines with water shoots declines. So if you were to go out into your vineyard and assess the severity, you can start to get a picture of what the likelihood is of your vines recovering from remedial surgery. And the same with the severity of brown staining in the upper trunk and in the lower trunk. You can see as the severity increases, the proportion of vines that recover decreases. So what are our recommendations to growers is that really you want to try to intervene earlier before you start seeing a decline, if possible, in your productivity, particularly in susceptible varieties. So our recommendation is that growers go out and regularly evaluate vineyard blocks for dieback in the canopy, ideally in at least one full row, but the more you do, the more accurate your data will be. And if possible, just assess it in the same rows years after year so you can start to build a picture of how quickly the disease is affecting your block. As the incidence and severity of disease in the canopy increases, our recommendation is then to start thinking about examining the trunk for staining and trying to establish how far that and how severe that disease has progressed in the trunks and the impact it will have on water chute recoveries. And then when you cut, again, a row at least, but more if possible, and then you can start to also get a feel of its recovery rates based on water chute presence. So the pathogens are known when inoculated into young tissue to grow in advance of the staining. So as part of the project, we looked at how far in advance the staining can be found in mature vines to help us provide advice on where to cut the vines. So trunks were taken from each of the trial blocks, and ones where the staining was further up the vine, and these were then at regular intervals sampled and tested for trunk disease pathogens. And on these columns here indicates the presence by plus or absence of Botchleria dieback or Utica dieback pathogens. As you can see, these pathogens can occur quite long distances in advance of the staining, particularly Botchleria dieback, but also occasionally Utica dieback. So our recommendation would be try and cut as low as possible. That still allows growth of a water chute to try and eliminate as much of the pathogen as you can. Before we started, there was some anecdotal evidence that potentially cutting in spring might improve your water chute recoveries versus winter. So as part of the trial, we investigated this and looked at the differences in recovery between vines cut in spring and winter. As you can see, there's no significant differences each year between those cut in winter and spring, at least in this trial, and we didn't observe it in the Hawke's Bay trial either. But potentially, if you were living in an area or had a block in an area which is prone to late frosts, then potentially a spring cut may be better to do, because what we found was that the vines cut in winter tended to bud burst earlier than those cut in spring. So what impact does remedial surgery have on vine health? It's still very early days, but so far we haven't seen any evidence of dieback in the canopies of the remediated vines, but occasionally we have seen some vine death. One of the questions that we're frequently asked by growers is, well, what if we fail to remove all of the staining from the trunks? What impact does this have on transmission of dieback potentially into the new trunks? So we took some of the new trunks 3 years post-remedial surgery and compared new trunks from vines where the staining was close or present at the cut site versus those where it was distant, and looked at the presence of the pathogens. As you can see, Botchleria dieback was widely detected in the new trunk, at the basal end of the new trunks, irrespective of whether staining was close or distant. Utah was less frequently detected, and we weren't able to see any differences in abundance. And I guess the big question is, what impact does remedial surgery have on productivity? Still early days, but as you can see on this photo, on this graph, which is tracking the yields in the control vines, which are untreated over time, there appears to be a decline, and then when you look at the recoveries of vines that were remediated in the first year of the project, these vines weren't thinned, but already in the second year following, or second vintage following remedial surgery, you can see that yields are comparable to our untreated control with seasonal differences. The vines that were remediated in the second year of the project were fruit thinned, and so that's the reason for it being a bit lower. But again, recovery is relatively quick. And similarly for vines remediated in the third and fourth years. So these are early days, really need to keep tracking these vines to really understand what ongoing impact remedial surgery has on vine productivity. We also looked at, again, similar to what I described before, what impact staining had on yields when the staining was present at the cut site or not present. And occasionally you can see, some years you can see some small differences in yield between those that didn't have staining versus those that did have staining, but not consistent year after year. As part of the project, the team at BRI took up some of the grapes that were harvested 3 years post remedial surgery and looked at the wine quality of the fruit from the control versus vines that were remediated in the first year of the project. They showed that there was no negative effects on wine quality, and that potentially there were some benefits in terms of the aroma compounds that are produced. Excuse me. So the key findings to date is that the disease does increase significantly in the canopy and trunk over 4 to 5 years, and that the disease is widespread by the time productivity is affected. And the severity of the disease can impact the recovery of new trunks in some varieties. The pathogens are detected in advance of the trunk staining, that probably it will be more difficult to eliminate BD pathogens by remedial surgery. But that being said, it looks like these pathogens may have the capacity to exist latently for some time. Remedial surgery does disrupt the progression of the disease, and productivity and quality gains have been recorded. But there's no obvious signs of trunk disease as yet after 5 years following remedial surgery. And water shoot recoveries are not affected by the season that cut. Our recommendations to growers is that they do make an effort to monitor the disease in the canopy and the trunk and try to intervene as early as possible based on what they see. Cut as low as practical, and you can cut in winter or spring. The downside of cutting in spring is that you have a lot more sap flow, and it does tend to push your wound protection off. And our recommendations is that we continue looking at using these trials to study the long-term impact of remedial surgery on vine productivity and longevity These trials are unique and they provide us an opportunity to really compare what the outcomes are if you don't intervene versus remedial surgery, and what the costs are of delaying intervention, because remedial surgery has been staggered over 5 years. This will help us to really measure the cost benefit of remedial surgery and begin to understand the economic threshold for remedial surgery. Finally, I'd like to thank all the key funding bodies that have made it possible for us to do these trials, as well as the team at Villa Maria in Devon and Dr. Mark Zusnowski, who's been actively involved in this project. Thank you.